make-believe flag controversy. This revolves around the Alito flying of the upside-down distressed flag. I'll assume that a lot of you know what I'm talking about here, but just a really quick and brief recap. Justice Alito was pictured outside of his house. He wasn't, sorry. A flag was pictured being flown upside down at his house after the January 6th riots. I refuse to call it an insurrection because that's not what it was. Just vocabulary-wise, that's not what it was. There's a big whole story being made about this. At the end of the day, what it seems like is it ultimately comes down to a neighborhood dispute. One of the Alito neighbors in the neighborhood put up a flag that had some explicit language on it, and in response to that, Samuel Alito's wife, or at least he says, flew the flag upside down, a signal of distress. And now, 3 years later, the mainstream lefty media is saying, look at what the Supreme Court justice did after the January 6th insurrection. Their words, not mine. They're also now, I guess, floating around another picture of a different flag that says appeal to heaven, which is like a John Locke quote. It doesn't matter, but in order to somewhat configure a way to tangentially attach a Supreme Court justice to crazy people that were being dumb on January 6th, and I'll say that they were being dumb. In order to conflate these, not conflate, but in order to connect these two pieces together, we're going to say this. It's all stupid and it's all ridiculous. First of all, you should know, if you don't know this story super well, apparently the Washington Post, I think by their own admission, said, yeah, they had this story back when it happened 3 years ago and didn't really think anything of it, and so they didn't run the story. And again, the Washington Post, if you don't know this, is not a conservative bastion of Trumpian MAGA beliefs. No, if they thought it was important or they thought it would help their side, they would have run the story then. But nevertheless, the story is getting a bunch of play. It's stupid because, again, it seems to be a neighborhood dispute admitted by everybody involved. It happened 3 years ago, and three, the last biggest point here is that if you're going to hold Justice Alito to some make-believe standard that, I don't know, he can't have his own political opinions or his wife can't have his own political opinions, all right, well then go ahead and hold your own to that. Because if you remember, in 2016, Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave speeches, made statements, I think in the Supreme Court specifically, that Trump was a faker. I think that was the big headline one, but also gave speeches talking about how bad Trump was. She donated money to Democrat campaigns. She clearly and unashamedly had her own political opinions. And did she recuse herself from any of the Trump campaigns? That's why, by the way, sorry, back up a little bit. I forgot to mention this. The whole reason here is to try to get Alito to recuse himself from any of the upcoming Trump either appeals or decisions that the Supreme Court has to make, which again is stupid because an outspoken Trump hater, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RBG, didn't recuse herself from any of the cases that were brought before the Supreme Court in which Trump was involved. Now, before I just go and make those statements without giving any sort of background on it, 2018, Trump versus Hawaii. This case challenged the president's travel ban, which restricted entry into the United States from several, the quote-unquote Muslim ban, but from several countries that were deemed by the Obama administration to be dangerous. Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not recuse herself from that and was part of the justice in the dissenting view. Trump versus Vance, which is, we won't get into the specifics of all of these. Trump versus the Manzers USA LLP, Department of Homeland Security versus the Regents of the University of California system, another Trump case which Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not recuse herself, and the list goes on of all of these different cases that Trump was involved in after Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, well, Trump's a faker, I hate the guy, did not recuse herself. So the fact that she was so outspoken against Donald Trump and also then subsequently did not say, well, okay, I have a bias here, I don't want to insert my bias into these, and therefore I will recuse myself. The fact that she didn't do that, the idea then that a story that was not important enough to the Washington Post to publish 3 years ago when it happened is all of a sudden such a big deal that any upcoming Trump cases before the Supreme Court, well, Justice Alito clearly is not qualified or not of sound mind enough, not unbiased enough to make a decision here in this particular case. That argument is ridiculous. Like, absolutely outside the lines, ridiculous. Here's the problem, though, and this, I'll explain more of this in my final thoughts here, is that regardless of how ridiculous the story is, so many people are continuing to cover it. MSNBC, I was watching because, well, sometimes I watch MSNBC to punish myself for my sins, force myself to watch that god-awful network. I believe it was Chris Hayes' show, did 2 back-to-back segments on this make-believe fake flag controversy. And the idea of doing that, in my head, is so absurd that you have to bring yourself to ask, well, why? Why are they doing this? Well, there's a couple reasons that they could be doing this. One is that their audience is so small that they're trying to pander to that audience in the desperate hopes to cling to that audience so that they don't go and, I don't know, become completely irrelevant because their audience has left them. Maybe that's the strategy of some of the cable news channels, CNN specifically, but MSNBC also, is that we will pander so hard to the little audience that we have left that we don't care if things are true or not, or they're actually a big deal, or what have you. We're just going to put it on our network because hopefully we can get some amount of ratings. And if that's the case, there are 2 things that can be said about the hosts that are willing to do that. Either one, they are dumber than we expect, but in giving any sort of latitude to those hosts, I don't think they're dumb. I don't think Rachel Maddow is dumb. I don't think Joy Reid is dumb. I don't think Chris Hayes is dumb. I don't think any of the other commentators they have on MSNBC are dumb. But that only leaves one other option. They're either dumb or they're lying. Which again, we'll talk more about this in the final thoughts, the fact that everybody's pretending all the time. So those could be the goals of the cable news channels. In the overall broader goal of the lefty agenda as a whole, the goal could be, well, exactly what they explicitly stated to be, is to destabilize the Supreme Court. For the first time in like 70 years, the Supreme Court leans to the right, a 6-3 conservative-leaning court. Now, we covered a story, I haven't been doing the show in a while, but I was on Real America's Voice with Steve Gruber talking about a story that the Supreme Court did not take up a case regarding gun rights. In other words, to call them an extreme MAGA court, okay, well, if that's the case, and they're not taking up some of the cases that I would like them to take up, as a person who I think is more pragmatist than anything, what does that make me? What does that make the people who look at this and go, yeah, this is I realize this is kind of a convoluted way of explaining what I'm trying to convey here. Here's what I'm saying. The Supreme Court is getting called all of these crazy names for the first time in a very long time. These right-wing extremist MAGA court, which again is hilarious considering some of the cases that they don't pick up. Off the top of my head, the Boise case talking about the constitutionality of one of the, I think it's a 5th court decision that says, well, Boise, and by default then the entire country, every city needs to have enough beds for the homeless people or else they can't enforce camping on the streets, urban camping, if you will. The Supreme Court didn't take that up, which again is crazy to me, but again, to call them a MAGA extremist court. They also didn't take up a gun case that I talked about on RAV last week. Bottom line here is calling them a MAGA extremist, right-wing fashion, whatever all of the big words that they use, to call them that is irrelevant and stupid. But still, they're trying to do it. Why? Well, I think they believe, from a bigger, broader umbrella lefty standpoint, is that if they can destabilize the Supreme Court, then they can enact a lot of the injustices that they're doing. We talked about the Trump case. If the left is successful in getting Americans to not believe in the Supreme Court, any of the appeals that would make its way all the way to the Supreme Court, in the Trump case, but also in any case, they can say, well, of course, the Supreme Court is just a MAGA agenda court that means absolutely nothing. And so for those reasons, the ratings reasons, the small audience reasons, trying to destabilize the authority of the Supreme Court, which is the last vestige of American federal institutions that anybody has really any faith in, and even then it's really still not that high. For those reasons are why people continually lie about this particular Alito story, but in a more broader sense, even pulling the Supreme Court out of it, is why people are lying about everything.